Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We still have quite a lot of participants coming in, so we'll give it another 30 seconds and then we'll get started. Please bear with us for a bit longer. Good. I think we can get a head start while the last few participants come in. Again, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar. This is a launch webinar to announce and publicly launch a new ICAP publication, but we also see it pretty much as an opportunity to have a bit of a discussion on this topic, which is if you're closely involved in the carbon pricing and carbon markets work, it is one of the hot topics at the moment. Before we dive in, as a quick note of context, my name is Stefano De Clara, and I'm the head of the ICAP Secretariat. ICAP stands for the International Carbon Action Partnership, and we are a partnership between governments worldwide that get together under the auspices of ICAP to jointly work on ETS design and implementation. So one of the key functions that ICAP have, and one of the roles that we serve as the ICAP Secretariat, is to facilitate work and discussions between ICAP members on key topics related to ETS design and implementation. We have spent quite a few years by now working on the future of emission trading systems and looking at the broad topic of ETS and net zero. This work started all the way back in 2020, 2021, when we did work to understand the integration of removal credits into emission trading system. It was followed by another piece of work, another publication a couple of years ago that looked at the relationship between emission trading systems and carbon capture and storage activities. And we now have yet another iteration of this work, which looks a bit more broadly at the future of emission trading systems in net zero trajectories, but also in a net zero scenario. I will not steal the thunder from my colleagues that have worked on it, but it is basically a broad-looking piece of work that tries to understand what role emission trading systems can play in a net zero context and on the way to a net zero context, and how they might evolve accordingly. As you probably know, emission trading systems are an effective and proven tool to reduce emissions, and they've been instrumental in many jurisdictions to reduce emissions up until today. But they could and potentially would serve a different role on the way to net zero. And this is pretty much the problem definition that we had when we started to work on this work stream. And it is what we tried to figure out. So over the next hour and a half, more or less, we will take you through some of the thinking that we did on this topic. And we will also get reactions from some of the ICAP members that have been on one side closely involved in this discussion, but at the same time that are trying to figure out these aspects and these considerations in the context of real-world policymaking in their systems. And we will also get perspectives from industry and for market participants on what is a topic that really lies at the core of what will be next for emission trading systems. Before we dive right in, also a quick note of housekeeping. We want to keep this discussion quite interactive, and we want to engage you as an audience in the discussion as well. So don't be shy and feel free to put comments, questions, and whatever you want to raise through the Q&A function of the webinar. What we will do is that in a few seconds, we will kick off the substantive part of the discussion with a presentation on our thinking and on the work that we did so far, and a presentation on the key outcomes and insights from the paper that we are releasing. We will then go into a moderated panel discussion where I will kick off the discussion with the first quick round of questions, but then I'm quite keen to progress the discussion with the questions that you will be posing. So again, don't be shy and put questions through the Q&A function of the webinar, and then we'll take it from there. So we're really planning to have an interactive panel discussion on the paper and on this topic, pretty much shaped by what you're interested in and what you will be asking and what we'll be raising through the Q&A function of the webinar. Last but not least, and before I give the floor to my colleague Stephanie, I wanted to acknowledge two things. First of all, the paper, as of a few minutes ago, is publicly available on our website. So maybe not right now because we wanted to pay attention, but after the webinar, go on our website and have a look at the paper. I wanted to acknowledge the great work that ICAP colleagues put in this paper. So obviously I want to recognize my colleague Stephanie, who will be presenting on this webinar, but also my colleagues Victor Ortiz Rivera and Katia Bedenkopf that have been closely involved in the development of this work over the last few months. And also big thanks to our colleague Hermia Chan for all of her help in getting this paper across the finish line. I also wanted to acknowledge the great input and support that ICAP members have provided on this journey, and that and the role that they have played in shaping this piece of work and our thinking on this topic. And obviously, last but not least, thanks to the great set of panelists that have agreed to join us today to discuss this topic with you. I will introduce them obviously a bit later, but thank you to Felix Gray from the UK Department for Energy Security and Net Zero, Julia Michalak from AITA, the International Emission Trading Association. Thank you for Mark Cipolla from the California Air Resources Board for taking time early in his morning to be with us. And last but not least, also big thanks to Ruben Vermeeren from the DG Clima at the European Commission for being here with us. This said, and hoping that I'm not forgetting any fundamental housekeeping, I will happily give the floor to my colleague Stephanie to start delving into this discussion. With that, Steph, over to you, and please kick us off.
Thank you. Thank you, Stefano, and hello, everyone. It's great to be here. I want to begin with what I think is the main message of the paper, which is a really simple message, actually, which is that there are actually lots of options for how emission trading systems can evolve and the role that they can play in a net zero and a net negative policy mix. And this is because emission levels coming out of the ETS may mirror broader jurisdictional goals, but they don't have to. So a jurisdiction that has a net zero target, for example, and has an ETS, that ETS can deliver net zero, but it doesn't have to. It can deliver net positive. The ETS can also deliver net negative. It can be an absolute zero ETS that functions as a ban on emissions, or there can be no ETS at all. Importantly, each of these options could be a step in an evolution. So you could have a net positive ETS evolving into net zero and thereafter net negative, but that need not be the case. Each of these options are actually a steady state in and of themselves. In this presentation, I will walk you through these 5 options. Then I will talk a little bit, very little, about cross-cutting design considerations, and I will conclude with some discussion and concluding thoughts. So on to net positive emissions. If my mouse works, there we go. So net positive ETSs are the default setting for ETSs that we have today. So it is a system where the regulator continues issuing conventional allowances. Now, the system may or may not allow for example, removal units, but for as long as conventional allowances are being issued and used in the system, the atmosphere will see a net increase in GHG emissions. And so this is a system that promotes abatement while leaving room for residual emissions. And by separating entirely or at least partially the incentives for abatement from the incentives for removals, it also reduces the risk of abatement deterrence, and that is something I will talk about in the next slide. There are two critical choices that the regulator needs to make. The first is defining the volume of conventional allowances that will exist in the market and that establish the limit on net residual emissions. And finally, to the extent that the jurisdiction has a net zero target and the ETS delivers net positive emissions, there will be a need for a policy mix of carbon dioxide removal to balance the emissions from the net emissions from the ETS. And this is what you can see in this image. So this is the jurisdiction. This jurisdiction has emissions and it has removals. I hope you can see my cursor. Emissions happen inside the ETS, but also outside the ETS. And in this particular case, it is an ETS that has provision for removal units. However, because allowances are still being issued, the net result is positive, such that for the jurisdiction to achieve net zero, and this is what you see here on the right-hand side, CDR policies are required outside the ETS to address both the emissions from non-ETS sectors and to address the net emissions from the ETS, right? So this is what a net positive ETS looks like, and this is where more or less everybody is starting from. Now, a net zero ETS works differently, and that is because it requires that residual emissions that exist in the ETS be balanced, but not with fiat allowances, but with carbon dioxide removal. And this is what we see here, right? So the ETS now takes care of its own emissions. The ETS delivers net zero, and there's still a need for a policy mix for carbon dioxide removal to address emissions from outside the ETS, but these policies will not have to deal with emissions coming from the ETS. What is important to realize is that in this case, the ETS ceases to have conventional allowances. It trades exclusively in removal units, and in so doing, it could be seen as having transitioned into being a removals trading system. A challenge in the case of net zero ETSs is that by combining the incentives for abatement with the incentives for removals, we have a risk of abatement deterrence. And that is the concern that abatement that could and should happen ceases to happen, either because of the presence or because of the hope of future removal units. And this can be a problem. So imagine a situation where a covered entity defers or entirely cancels investments in abatement technologies because that covered entity expects or hopes for cheap and abundant removals in the future. Now, this would mean that that entity has set itself on a path of higher emissions than would otherwise have been the case, which can be highly problematic if in the future those hoped for removals actually don't materialize. And this could make it much harder and potentially much costlier for jurisdictions to achieve their emission and their climate targets. And so abatement deterrence is a very big issue here. And net zero ETSs do allow, in theory, for a cost-effective mix of abatement and removal because you're putting them in the same market and you're allowing the market to determine when it makes sense to abate and when it makes sense to remove. Now, this cost effectiveness is contingent on several issues, three of which we can see here on the screen. One is what I already told you about, the economically ineffective abatement deterrence. Another problem is making sure that abatement and removal are actually fungible. So think about reversals and liability issues. And it's also really important to make sure that all externalities are priced in. So think about societal consequences and costs of competition for land in the case of high additional uses of biomass, for example, for bioenergy with CCS. So that much on net zero. Let us move into net negative. Now, a net negative ETS is one where the residual ETS emitters deliver net negative. So what you can see here is the ETS is delivering more removals than its gross emissions, and therefore enables the jurisdiction to either address some of the residual emissions in non-ETS sectors, or potentially to address, for example, overshoot emissions. What is important here is that we looked at options where it is the regulated entities that deliver net negative. We're not looking at options where the regulator, the government, uses, for example, auction revenues to fund a procurement program for CDR. We're really looking at the actions of regulated entities and how they can deliver net negative. So how do you deliver net negative like that? Well, for example, by requiring 2 removal units for each 1 emission that those covered entities cause. Now, this delivers negative emissions for as long as they're gross emissions in the ETS, because negative emissions will be a function of gross emissions, and it can overburden, in so doing, quite already strained residual emitters, especially if CDR is expensive at that point in time. The next option is, if my mouse works, there we go, is absolute zero. So an absolute zero ETS functions like a ban on emissions. And this is what you can see here with this empty box. The ETS has no gross emissions anymore. And how does that work? The regulator ceases to issue allowances, and there are no provision for removal units. So this means that once the bank of allowances has been used up, and in the presence of make good provisions, which is a provision that requires that there always be an allowance every time that there is an emission, then the ETS functions as a ban on emissions and pushes gross emissions under the scope of the ETS to zero. Now, this is feasible only in sectors where full decarbonization is both technologically and economically feasible, which makes this option highly theoretical at this point in time. Moreover, it can be seen as draconian, especially if affordable CDR is available in society. Moving on from absolute zero ETSs, we have finally no ETS, right? And this is an option where this ETS ceases to exist. This can be because the ETS is too small to provide for effective price discovery, or because other policies, for example, sectoral policies, are considered more effective in achieving mitigation goals. The ETS could, for example, morph into a carbon tax. So if we eliminate those make good provisions that I mentioned earlier and institute a fixed fine per ton of CO2, the ETS has effectively become a carbon tax. So this is it that I wanted to tell you about those 5 options for how an ETS could look like in the future. Looking at the time, I want to very quickly tell you about cross-cutting design considerations that we identified in the paper very, very briefly. One is thinking about the definitions of residual and hard-to-abate emissions. There are actually lots of ways of defining this, and how societies and policymakers define what constitutes residual and what constitutes hard to abate will be crucial in determining limits to gross emissions, limits to net emissions, and understanding what type of economies we will have in the future. Abatement deterrence is a major concern for all options that involve removal units in the ETS, as I was telling you earlier. Issues of small markets. So markets are likely to become smaller and smaller as covered emissions hopefully dwindle over time. But small markets can very quickly lose liquidity and cease to function effectively. And so these issues of small markets are quite relevant to all options that retain trading elements. Jurisdictions that are linked to each other may have to coordinate as caps decrease. And in the paper, we also look at the various options for generating removal units inside and outside the ETS. And we look at both considerations of the type of unit that CDR suppliers receive. So is it a credit or is it a fully fungible allowance? And the route to market. Do regulated entities purchase removal units directly from the CDR market, or do they go, for example, through a government agency? So these are aspects that we explore at length in the paper. So that much on cross-cutting design considerations. finally, I want to leave you with some parting thoughts. The first you already know is that the trajectory of ETSs is an open question with multiple possibilities, and there's really a lot to unpack there. The second is on scope expansion. So scope expansion is really relevant here because expanding the coverage of the ETS can really alter both the feasibility and the desirability of different end states. Think about the difference of one jurisdiction that has an ETS that covers 50% of its emissions and another jurisdiction that has an economy-wide ETS. So the feasibility of a net positive ETS, for example, can really change if these jurisdictions both would like to have to achieve their targets with only domestic units, and it may be impossible for you to achieve your target domestically if you have an economy-wide ETS that has net positive emissions. You may have noticed in the presentation that we differentiate between gross and net emissions, and you may also have noticed that I tried very hard to not use the word cap. And this is because the term cap can be very confusing as soon as we start putting in a lot of additional compliance units in the ETS. So we have found that making a clear difference between gross and net emissions is very helpful in thinking about how we design ETSs and what are the instruments that we put in place to address these different dimensions. Also, and I think this almost goes without saying now, but it's still, I think, important to emphasize, is that ETSs can drive demand for removal units and they can support the development and deployment of CDR, but they're very, very unlikely to be sufficient. We're going to need much more extensive policy mixes for CDR if we are to deliver the volume of CDR that seems to be necessary in the second half of the century. Also related to CDR, important to acknowledge that some designs of ETS may be quite vulnerable to the risk that certain removal technologies do not become viable at scale, and it will be important to design ETSs taking that failure mode into account. And relatedly, it will be also important to understand what is it that we're aiming towards in the long term. So what is the policy mix for net negative, and how do we go from here to there, and what can be the role of the ETS over time in that context? Speaking about the future of ETSs also requires us clarifying what we mean by an ETS, right? Is an ETS the regulated entities plus the regulator? Is an ETS that has been converted into a removals trading system still an ETS? What happens if it morphs into a carbon tax? I think these issues of terminology, they feel like just semantics, but when we're having policy discussions, we can very quickly have a situation where we're using the same words but meaning different things. And I think over time it will be useful for us to clarify what we mean with those. And finally, here's some areas for further research. So dynamics for small markets, addressing abatement deterrence, policy mixes for net negative, considerations for intensity-based systems, the list goes on and on. But that's all I wanted to say for now. Thank you for this, and I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Steph. And I mean, first of all, thank you for graciously covering so much ground over a quick and very clear presentation. And obviously, again, thanks, big congratulations to you and the other colleagues involved in this work for finally putting this out. We will have the chance to delve into some of this in the panel discussion in a second. But again, I would encourage all of you and all participants to have a look at the report. Steph covered the overall outline, the basics, and the key takeaways. But there's much more content in the actual report that I'm sure you would find interesting. With that, let's move on to the panel discussion now. I will ask my panelists to turn their camera on and come on the virtual stage. At the same time, a reminder to all of you as participants that I'll be kicking off the panel discussion, and I have a few questions that I want to pose to the panelists. But we are also hoping to have a lively and interactive discussion with you all. So don't hesitate to raise any question, comment, or insight you want to provide through the Q&A function of the webinar. We'll be keeping an eye on that, and as soon as we have questions coming in, we'll go to the panel with those. But first things first, I still owe real introductions to the panelists, and thank you again to all of you for being here with us today. As I was saying before, we really wanted to use the excuse of launching the paper as a way to have a conversation on these topics with some of the people that have been at the forefront of these discussions. So we invited some of the key policymakers that are grappling with these issues in the context of their systems, as well as industry representatives that are shaping this discussion on the side of the covered entities and market participants more broadly. So I'm very happy to have with us today Julia Michalak, who is the European Policy Director at IETA, the International Emission Trading Association, Felix Gray, who is the Policy Lead on greenhouse gas removals in the UK and for the UK ETS, Mark Cipolla, who is the Chief of the Cap and Trade Program at the California Air Resources Board, and Ruben Vermeeren, who is the Deputy Head of Unit at DG Klima in the European Commission. So as a way to kick off the panel discussion, I want to ask a general question to all of you, and maybe we'll start with Felix. I would like to then go to Ruben, on to Mark, and then we'll come to Julia. And the question basically is, and again, before we delve into the specifics of your respective systems, at the more general level, I would like to hear your initial reactions to the report outcomes, but also to what Steph just outlined. And I mean, as we just talked about, the report outlines and identifies different possible future trajectories for emission trading systems, including net zero and net negative options. As you went through them and as you heard Steph talking about them, are there any particular elements or particular models and particular scenarios that resonate particularly with you? And would you agree with the overall framing of what we described in terms of the role of ETS in achieving net zero, especially in a context where in many different jurisdictions we are approaching fast declining caps, and we are getting closer to that discussion. And also let us know if there's any additional thought or any additional consideration on the challenges and opportunities that we identified in the report. With that, Felix, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stefano. Hi, everyone. To start with my kind of reaction to the report and lots of the wider work that Stephanie and her team have done, there's almost nothing in here that I don't agree with. I think it's just incredibly good work, bringing a huge amount of clarity to this complicated question. It's so clear and rigorous, and the conclusions are kind of pretty much right. I mean, I think she and the team have really kind of pinpointed the trade-offs for us and the choices. So I think that's my answer to your first question. We agree with the kind of factual content of the report. I think in terms of where the UK government is with this, we have committed to putting engineered what we call greenhouse gas removals, or CDR, what a lot of other people call it. We've committed to putting removals in the UK ETS, the UK's compliance carbon market. We've consulted on how to do that, and we're in the process of responding to that consultation. So there'll be more detail coming out shortly in terms of the way we think it's best to structure this future market. I think, we agree with lots of the things that Stephanie has pointed out in terms of if you did want a net zero ETS one day, then these are the kind of choices that you need to make. We agree on lots of the things that Stephanie raises. I think for us, we definitely see this as a big change and something you want to do gradually and slowly if it is net zero ETSs that you're aiming for. So definitely in terms of the way we're approaching this, is we're thinking about this very big, ambitious, long-run change, but we're also prioritizing maintaining the current and original purpose of the UK ETS, which is to drive abatement in the sectors that it covers. So anything that we do has to be done in a way that's consistent with kind of prioritizing that outcome. And what that means a bit more concretely is maintaining market stability in the ETS and not doing something that's going to upset the balance of supply and demand for allowances, and not doing anything that would compromise the environmental integrity of the scheme. So obviously, the UK ETS is a high integrity carbon market, and we don't want to do anything that would compromise that. In terms of other specific outcomes we're aiming for, again, Stephanie's kind of raised them all. But abatement deterrence is definitely a priority for us. So we do not want to do something here that helps removals happen, but does that at the expense of less abatement, so more positive emissions somewhere else in the system, and that's a priority for us. We also want to do this in a way that does meaningfully support removals deployment. And again, we agree with Stephanie that probably an ETS on its own is not going to be enough for that. You're going to need other supporting policies in place. I'm happy to kind of go into what some of those are in the UK context. But clearly you can't use a policy instrument like an ETS, which is designed to achieve least cost decarbonisation, at the same time as saying we have a new technology that's going to be really important for net zero, we need to roll it out. It's currently a new technology, and therefore it's going to need some kind of extra support in place. So we definitely accept you need to balance those two things. And ETS is therefore kind of part of the policy mix, but not the only thing that you do on removals. Very happy to go into more details in the Q&A if people want, but those are some of our kind of reactions to the report and our priorities as we approach this work.
I was on mute. Thank you, Felix, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of those points in a second, especially on what else it takes to then support the deployment of removals. But before that, I want to go to Ruben next with basically the same question. So any immediate reaction, thought, or consideration on the key takeaways from the report?
Thank you, Stefano, and thank you, Stephanie, and congratulations to you and to Katja and Victor for having finalized this. I think it must feel very good to have it out there, because I think we saw a first version maybe in the summer last year, or maybe it was October that we saw it first, and we liked it immediately a lot. I'm a big fan. We reacted to it at the annual meeting. Because we think it's a very welcome contribution to the debate. And in fact, it is helping us, and it has already been helping us, even in its draft version, in our considerations on how to move forward, thinking about 2040, thinking about the role of the EU ETS in that overall target, and also thinking about the possible integration of removals in the EU ETS, of course. So I think what is interesting about this paper is that it distinguishes these 5 types of end goals, and it helps you then determine when you know where you want to go, it helps you determine the policies to get there. As you said, there are lots of options for where an ETS can be going, but this paper does really well in structuring them. So organizing your thinking and then knowing where to go and how to design the policies. Another thing that we particularly liked about this paper is that we noted that the removals debate was very much dominated by stakeholders with an interest or with a focus on kickstarting removals. And that's very important, of course, but their main preoccupation seems to be where will the demand come from, where will the finance for expensive removals come from, and then they would quickly identify the nearest compliance market as let's say the solution for everything. And this paper does it differently. It takes the ETS as a starting point, and we think that's very useful. not so much because the ETS is an objective in itself, but because, as Felix also said, it's a complex and a delicate policy instrument. And so once you have it working well, and we think the EU ETS is working rather well in these recent years, we have to be extremely careful in amending it and changing it. Stefano, you asked, are there particularly any designs that resonate with you? I think it's too early to say for us if we're heading for a net zero ETS. We're always aligning with our economy-wide targets. I think you called the absolute zero ETS a draconian measure. I think it's still the legal default, though, as long as you have an LRF that continues going down, that's ultimately where you end up. But indeed, the question becomes more and more permanent or prominent if that is indeed the trajectory that you want to continue taking. So we are looking at integration, as I said before. This is a legal obligation, but there are also clear pros to such integration. But there are also side effects that we want to look into very closely, and that you're also helping us look into very closely. Abatement deterrent is indeed one, as Felix mentioned. Good MRV is another one. For us, it's very important to have our CRCF, carbon removal certification framework, in place. That would really be the starting point. We're also looking at starting sensibly, in the sense of limiting our approach to permanent removals, BECCS and DACs, to domestic removals, not international. And that is, I think, for the moment, where we are. The next step will be a public consultation, because we want this review to be really based on deep analysis, but also on input from as many stakeholders as possible. So we hope to launch that very soon. We've been a bit delayed, but it should be coming out very soon now. I'll stick to that for the moment, and then happy to elaborate in the Q&A.
Thank you, Ruben. Mark, let's come to you next. Same question, same task. Tell us what you think and what you make of the report and also of the overall discussion. Thank you.
Same response. It's really, really good work, and I think incredibly valuable. And I think I mentioned this in a previous conversation. When I first heard about this work, my very initial response, which I now see as pretty naive, was, why are we talking about this now? There are so many more immediate concerns. But I think it's important to talk about this now, given the status of existing ETSs and plenty of these net zero targets. It takes a lot of, there's a lot of work to do to understand these questions. This work really provides what I see as a great framework to have these discussions. I mean, it really does lay out clearly a full suite of options. It does a great job at raising the points that are going to need to be wrestled with and kind of teeing those up with some really thoughtful conversation and discussion within the paper that I think is going to be really useful for policymakers as we wrestle with how we achieve our targets. So yeah, it really does provide an excellent platform to have those conversations. And turning to the California, I think, have a fairly clear plan, and essentially we have legislative direction loosely on what our program will look like given our targets, because we have a twofold target in 2045, which is to get to statewide carbon neutrality, net zero, but B, recognizing that there's another target of 85% reduction in anthropogenic emissions. So our legislature has sort of, in some sense, set a cap on what those residual emissions will be at 15% of our 1990 levels. In looking at that, I think we see that as still a large enough market to be liquid to permit price discovery. When we take a little closer look, the components of those residual emissions are kind of things like high global warming potential gases, so refrigerants and methane in some cases, industrial emissions, process emissions from high heat needs that may still be needed and not fully decarbonized given costs there, and maybe even some for electricity reliability, so providing filling in where renewables may not fully be integrated with storage. So those are the kind of the three prongs that I think that are envisioned at where we're sitting now as likely residual emissions 20 years in the future. And the way California's approaching that is with still a net positive ETS likely, and with a separate and distinct CDR program. So we also have legislative direction on spinning up a new carbon capture, utilization, and storage program, along with a carbon dioxide removal and storage program. Those conversations are just getting underway, really. We're hiring people to work on that effort. And, so taking the first steps toward that, but, likely that will be a program that is separate and distinct from the ETS. There very likely could be incorporated additional incentives within the ETS to promote CDR activities, but I see it as again a little bit of a multi-pronged strategy for incentivizing CDR, because I think that depending on the type, there could be positives there, and it's also an interesting. I think you briefly touched on this. Thinking about this trajectory in linkage discussions, and California has a linkage partner in Quebec. I think it's probably something that jurisdictions that are linked ought to start thinking about now as we plan together our joint market. And it's probably an important thing that we consider as we engage in linkage discussions with other governments. Right now, we're doing some of that with the state of Washington and their ETS. And, this is, likely something that, ought to be shared and discussed in that realm also. And I guess as a final note, I will say, the California ETS does include removals in the form of forest offset credits right now. It's a limited part of our program, but right now, compliance entities can use offset credits to meet up to 4% of their obligation. And the vast majority of those offset credits are forest offset projects, which essentially represent a removal from the atmosphere. And California has a sister market program, the Low Carbon Fuel Standard for transportation fuels, which actually does include direct provisions for recognizing direct air capture in the carbon intensity pathways of different fuels and providing credits for that. I believe the status of that, I don't oversee that program, but I believe the status is, if there's a provision there maybe have been some applications, but no fully realized projects yet at this point. So there are some kind of early stage examples here. And I'll leave it at that. Much appreciation for the excellent work to Stephanie and the team, and looking forward to additional discussion.
Thank you, Mark. I want to go to Yulia next. And AITA is obviously an organization that brings together covered entities, market participants, and a broader carbon market ecosystem active in all the existing ETSs globally. So I wanted to ask you how you personally, but also how ITA members are looking at this discussion. And again, what do you make out of these different scenarios, and what lies ahead for emission trading systems?
Yeah, thank you, Stefano, and thank you for invitation to join this panel and for an excellent presentation, Stephanie. As you are partially introduced already, ITA, Stefano, I'll just very briefly add that we represent currently over 300 members that are active both in compliance and voluntary markets, and we advocate for effective market-based solutions to climate change. That means that we are very much in favor of emissions trading systems to be the main tool to deliver net zero targets. And we think that this is a perfect moment for your report to come into discussion, as the EU and the UK are considering the changes to a design of their emissions trading. So the report comes in a very right moment to inform this conversation, and makes a valid point, kind of reminding everyone that although we are still 20 years before the EU ETS cap under the current RF reaches zero, for businesses it's like tomorrow. So we are literally 2 business cycles away from that moment. And for businesses, it is absolutely crucial to have visibility and for long-term strategic planning and certainty on the regulatory side. So this is for us a very fundamental, relevant value I would like to kind of bring here into this conversation, that the discussing design of negative ETS is relevant as we are awaiting the decisions, so to provide businesses with this forward-looking information. So as we advocate for a market design that provides stability and provides this long-term planning, there are a couple of features that are very relevant for this, and this is a scarcity and liquidity. And here is where removals would play a very relevant role under tightening caps. I know, Stephanie, that this is not a word that it's the one you'd like to maybe focus, but eventually we'll, under the current design, aiming to reach zero. While we do expect to have residual emissions, and it will be relevant to have a solution to that. That's why to provide and inject liquidity into the market and reduce volatility that we expect will be increasing under these tightening caps, we recommend to consider integration of removals. For the EU ETS, we have a position that permanent carbon removals should be integrated under the EU ETS with some predefined limits, although we see a role for both engineered and nature-based removals to be recognized under the future design of a policy framework. We also advocate for linking compliance markets, and given we have EU and the UK officials here on this webinar, I can even highlight that the most natural first step in this, in our view, should be linking of EU and UK ETS that has multiple economic advantages. And one of them is also injecting this liquidity that we expect to get smaller. And of course, these markets share many design features, and they are kind of natural candidates to provide this benchmark for how to link to mature big markets. So while there are many options for designing ETS that delivers net zero, as you presented different options, we think that this predictability is crucial, and the decisions should be made relatively shortly. We've been advocating to start with removals being recognized under emissions trading in our submission to the UK consultation on GGR integration. We mentioned year 2028. In the EU, we mentioned before 2030. That boils down to a similar timing. So we would like to see these decisions, this conversation to advance, and these decisions being made, of course, with stakeholders being involved. And there are a number of questions that will have to be tackled in this when it comes to kind of more technical arrangements. So, for instance, related to the functioning of registries, MSR parameters for the EU, on how these allowances how allowances and removal credits will be kind of integrated. Should they be separated in the registries? Should they be kind of replacing one-to-one, for instance, removal credits, allowances, or should there be any kind of a discount rate? So many kind of more technical questions that will have to be responded to. And the very last point I'd like to mention from AITA's perspective is that while we advocate to start with removals that will be generated domestically for both EU and the UK markets, eventually we see a need to also consider integration of international removals.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for the interesting insights. We do now have almost 40 minutes for a follow-up discussion and the Q&A with the audience, which is great. Before we dive into that, and I see that we do have questions in the Q&A function of the webinar to get started from, but I wanted to give Stephanie the right of first response to what was said on the panel, if anything caught your attention. Otherwise, we'll move into taking questions from the audience. But let me know if you want to come back to anything that was said at this stage.
Thank you, but I think it's nicer to take questions from the audience.
Good. In that case, we'll start from a question that I guess it is mainly addressed to you and to the team working on the paper, but that also speaks to something that Felix was saying earlier. So I would also invite reactions to the other panelists, and it is basically about the net negative option, and speaks to basically what Felix was talking about in terms of the need to get in there in a gradual and stepwise way. So the question is, going straight for a 2-for-1 provision whereby emitters would have to hold and submit 2 removal units for each ton of emission could, as Steph also pointed out, could indeed overburden the emitters and could represent a significant tightening of the carbon constraint. So the question is, would you envisage or foresee a model where you would introduce that more gradually, starting from a 1-for-1 provision and then, for example, moving to a 2-for-1 over time? Or also on the timing element, did you consider relaxing the temporal connection between when emissions happen and when removals have to take place? So, for example, a system whereby you emit now, but you incur in an obligation to remove 1 or more than 1 ton at a later point in time. Let's start with you, Steph, but if others have thought as well, I would welcome them.
Yeah, it would also be nice to see if Mark can speak a little bit about the experience of California in that removal obligation proposal. So my answer to Benjamin's questions, thank you, Benny, for the question. Indeed, it is quite possible to ease the obligation in, and there actually are lots of proposals in the literature for this. I can put links in the chat if you're interested. And so this is where we also start thinking, okay, is it a new instrument? Are we morphing the ETS into a removal obligation system? Do these systems run in parallel and, slowly one takes over the other? Generally, yes, it is possible to ease the obligation in, both in terms of quantity and in terms of time. There are lots and lots of questions about how to design a removal obligation instrument. Not only who is covered, but also on what basis you put in the removal obligation. What is the removal obligation in practice? And when it comes to this temporal dimension, one thing that one needs to be careful, especially if we're talking about existing ETSs, is not falling into a possible moral hazard whereby we postpone the obligation into the future and then create a strong incentive to topple that instrument in the future so that that obligation never actually vests. So there are considerations of how you design the system to make it more resilient over time. Yeah, I'll stop there, but I can put a few links of proposals from the literature in the chat.
Thank you. Do others want to come in? I see nodding from Mark and a hand up from Felix. Felix, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for the question. So we've thought about this in the UK, and I can say what we're doing from a UK perspective is we're not going down a kind of 2-for-1 route. We're trying to think about how to design this as simply as possible. That obviously involves some trade-offs, which I can get to, but that's informed our approach of saying the principle should be if you permanently remove 1 ton of carbon, then you get given 1 allowance, and that's fully fungible with the other allowances in the system. And so that's the kind of principle underpinning it. No 2-for-1 approach. We're also not proposing any kind of removal obligation at this stage. So we're not saying that anybody has to buy that removal allowance that's now floating around the market. That would obviously be a way of pushing up demand for removals, and we're not proposing that in the ETS at this point. So that's kind of where we are on this allowance design question. To go back to the beginning of the question around net negative, this obviously doesn't get you to net negative in an ETS. Net negative is a difficult thing to do, and it involves either your compliance firms essentially overpaying in the way that Stephanie described, or the only other kind of mechanically, the only other option would be for the government to become a net buyer of allowances instead of like today, where governments are net sellers. So just mechanically, those are your options. Both of those clearly involve some pretty big trade-offs, and it's not something that the UK government is looking at the moment.
Thank you, Felix. Do others want to come in on this point? Mark?
Yeah, I can chime in just a little. I think similarly along what Felix just noted, the offset credits in the California cap and trade program, they're a 1-to-1 ratio. They are fungible with allowances, but again, there's a limited availability to use them for compliance. So we recognize up to a usage up to 4% of a compliance obligation, but those are like equal to, those offset credits are equal to an allowance in the system when used for compliance. There's no requirement to use them, but there's that option. And really, we view these offset credits as a cost containment mechanism. They're typically cheaper than the allowances in the system. So for a small amount, again, just like 4% of an obligation, there's an opportunity that many participants take advantage of to buy the offset credits, which maybe they're around over the last year, a discount of about 50%. So there's a small savings there, and that's really the incentive for procuring those removals. I'll note that so it's that kind of low cost that is the attractive feature of them. I'll note that we actually have 6 different project types that are recognized potentially in the California system. Only 4 of them have only 4 project types have ever generated credits, and there are 2 that have not, and I suspect that's because of the cost effectiveness challenges. There's for bringing such a project to market and generating credits may not be cost effective given the current market prices.
Thank you, Mark. Unless there are other thoughts on this point, I actually wanted to go to a different question, which is something that already came up in some of your initial remarks, which is if we are not funding and supporting removal activities through the ETS, what else can government do, or what else are governments doing to support the deployment of removals and CDR technologies? Anyone who wants to go first?
Maybe I can say a few words on that, because I raised it also indeed in my introductory remarks. Well, I think first of all, as I said, that at the start we thought the debate was very much focused on looking at the ETS and ETS integration as a panacea, and that would not be sufficient, but it would also not be a good idea. But I think if we don't focus on these alternatives, then we also don't develop them further. So it's a very good question, and I think it merits more debate. And we've also actively asked the stakeholders and some NGOs to think about these questions, and they organized also a workshop in Brussels on this question. I think the most difficult part of it is indeed to find a group of entities willing to pay for this, or obliging a certain group of entities to pay for this. And the question is, who would that be? And why would there be a good reason for them to pay? So you could say combating climate change and cleaning up the emissions we've made in the past is something that everybody will profit from. It's a public good, and so perhaps it should be simply a tax on everybody. That then raises revenues that governments can use to invest in removals and to kickstart this market. That will be very different, of course, from an ETS. You could also put that tax on companies, depending on their size, maybe depending on their activities. Oil and gas, for example, are industries that we put an obligation on in the Net Zero Industry Act and ZIA to develop CCS. Just as an example of singling out a certain group to do a certain thing. You could also look at existing emissions out there that are not priced yet, or where there is no polluter pays principle applied yet. There are still such emissions out there. We can think about historical obligations, carbon take-back obligations, things like that. Targets for member states is also something we can consider further. So I think there is, it's not for us to do, because we are in charge of the ETS, and we should be quite single-mindedly be focused on bringing down the emissions that are still in the system. There are a lot. But it would be good if indeed colleagues can also start developing these options further.
Thank you, Ruben. Mark, and then Felix.
Yeah, I'll note just a few of the financial pieces. In the US, there's actually a tax credit that's available for carbon capture and sequestration at $85 per ton, and carbon dioxide removal and sequestration at $135 a ton. That's, I think, a very attractive approach for many entities that might be considering it, because it's there, and if you can demonstrate the sequestration, you get the credit. There's no kind of application process, receiving money or developing application proposal and not getting a subsidy that's needed to actually break ground on a project. There's also, again, the incentives that California has in the LCFS program, and potentially the ETS, where those incentives could be layered on top of the tax incentives. And then just, again, these are maybe things that are outside some of our immediate purview as environmental regulators, but there's things like infrastructure support, identifying sequestration sites that have integrity. Permitting can be a real issue if there are pipelines that need to cross multiple ownership boundaries. Those types of things are big issues for getting projects like that actually can sequester. And maybe things that we do have control over: clear MRV, clear monitoring provisions, clear permanence requirements, such that projects know what their targets are. And yeah, maybe I'll just leave it there.
Thank you, Mark. Felix.
So in terms of the UK approach to this, I think the first thing I'd say is I agree with lots of Ruben's comments. We definitely see the ETS as primarily about getting carbon pricing right. So that obviously means carbon pricing emissions, but in a symmetrical way, also carbon pricing removals, but doing so in a tech neutral way. So that's part of the story of getting the incentives right for removal activities. But while removals are a new thing and costs are relatively high, there are lots of good public policy reasons why you would bring other policies into the mix to help encourage those things to happen. So in the UK, we're doing two main things. The first is work on standards. So basically getting the MRV right and developing standards for engineered removals. And the second one is using a carbon contract for difference to incentivize early deployment. So that's obviously something you can do once you have put removals in your ETS. You can, to some extent, also have CFDs based on voluntary carbon markets, but you might also want to have CFDs based on compliance carbon markets. And so those CFDs would be there to support early deployment and get that early deployment to happen. And again, that's kind of one of the things that would work well with putting removals in an ETS. So those are the two main things the UK is doing to support wider deployment.
Thank you, Felix. I would like to. I was about to come to you, Julia, with a slightly different topic, but let me know if you want to come on this subject still.
No, then maybe perhaps just very shortly. I think in the long term, this is very crucial that there will be a business case to invest in removals, and it should be simple, and those investments should be made attractive. And while the support policies that have been mentioned might be relevant in the initial phase, like CFDs and other tools that can be used, like procurement, and there are different options on how to design these public policies to help the uptake of removals. Basically, in the long term, when also a carbon price signal will be getting stronger under decreasing cap, there should be just a business case to drive this. And at the same time, the VCM can be, of course, at the moment, an interesting additional vehicle to pull up the demand. So that should be end goal, to have a clear, attractive incentive for businesses to invest into this market, and cost will be obviously falling over time.
Thank you. And on the topic of costing falling over time, both for removals but also for decarbonization, I actually wanted to ask you something, because we made it more than 1 hour into a debate on ETS and net zero without anyone bringing up competitiveness. And I'm sure that IETA, as an industry group, has done quite a lot of thinking on what competitiveness and competitiveness protection might look like as we move forward. So can you tell us something about what is ITA's thinking on the future of competitiveness under fast declining caps? And then obviously the same competitiveness point is open for comments also from other panelists as well.
Yeah, thank you for this question, Stefano. And I think it brings me into the direction of CBAM, as of course this is a newly proposed regulatory framework to to protect European industries against carbon leakage and eventually to replace free allocation under the EU ETS. There are also, of course, other jurisdictions, including the UK, that consider to put in place CBAM and planning on that. And for us, the kind of a perfect scenario would be to have, of course, global carbon pricing, linked markets, and this form of protection against carbon leakage, and to ensure that there is a level playing field in between competing industries would be the most desirable for us way of ensuring that. But this is not where we at the moment are heading for. Though we do support an effective CBAM, we see it already making a difference in terms of spurring interest in developing carbon pricing in multiple jurisdictions. So IETA is a supporter of this measure, and while we are looking from the kind of a global perspective on its impact on the promotion of emissions trading, this is quite incredible on what has been achieved in terms of being planned ETS or implemented ETS on a global scale. And in that context, of course, we are also well aware of the ongoing discussions in the EU and proposals for new tools to support industrial competitiveness, for instance, the development of industrial carbon bank. This is something that we learned very recently in the end of February in the publication of the Omnibus package and the Clean Industrial Deal. And we of course, will be watching this space to find out a little bit more about what are the plans with regard to use of EU ETS allowances for that purpose.
Thank you, Julia. Others that want to come in on the competitiveness topic? Felix.
So UK government is obviously concerned about competitiveness, and there's various different things we're doing. But I thought perhaps I could make a slightly different point about long-run competitiveness and the importance of cost-effective net zero. So I think if we are serious about net zero and competitiveness in the long run, then it's really key that we do net zero in a cost-effective way. And I think probably most economists would agree that trying to put everything in one market, so both removals and emissions in one market, where everyone can see that one price, and then these different things, both removals and emissions, can compete in a tech neutral way, that is very likely to be the kind of cornerstone of a cost-effective net zero in the long run, minimizing costs for consumers and businesses. So I think there's kind of specific things that we can and should be doing now, but there's also a long-run destination, and removals in an ETS is, I think, pretty likely to be part of the policy mix if you want to do net zero in a cost-effective way.
Thank you. Ruben.
Yes, maybe to react mostly to what Julia said, and thanks for the support for the measures under the Clean Industrial Deal. I think that reflects very much also the general feedback that we've been getting on this policy package that we presented in February, and that should result in several legislative proposals in the future. So competitiveness very much at the center of the debate, as you said, much more so than under, let's say, the first von der Leyen Commission. That's not necessarily a bad thing for the climate, because we stay the course, but we know that in order to stay the course and to meet our targets, we need to decarbonize our industry, because otherwise they cannot compete. The goods will be produced outside of Europe and we will have higher emissions. So we need effective leakage protection. And we hope that the CBAM will give that, and the simplified CBAM will be even better in doing that. We are working on demand-side incentives as well, lead markets for green products. I think that's very important because industry tells us there is no demand for our green products. We want to invest, but we have nobody to sell to. We're working on keeping electricity affordable. There is a new state aid framework for the Clean Industrial Deal that is being consulted right now, including a chapter for industrial decarbonization. Here, the point of Felix on cost effectiveness comes in. This is still based very much on competition, competitive bidding, but not in a stifling way. It shouldn't be overburdening. We shouldn't make the rules so difficult that nobody can comply with them. The ETS itself can also help. It's not just a stick. We have the revenues. A lot of those go to the Innovation Fund, the Modernization Fund. We give reallocation. We can maybe make that more conditional. And indeed, the Clean Industrial Deal announced also this new financial support instrument of the Industrial Decarbonization Bank that indeed, to some extent, may be funded from the ETS allowances. But we will elaborate on that in the Q3 2026 ETS review, which is the same review that will deal with the removals integration. So all of this indeed very important, all the more because the low-hanging fruit, especially from the power sector, we see that as being picked very rapidly. And so we're very soon going into a situation whereby industry will need to abate or pay a very high carbon price. And that's something I think we all know needs to be avoided.
Thank you, Ruben. I want to go to Stephanie next, and I'll bundle together a couple of questions which go in the direction of if we look at the models that you identified, how do we get there, practically speaking? Like, what does need to change in the design of the current systems to align with those models, and how practically we change the design elements or the elements of the market functioning of the current emission trading systems to get there, and also, as you said, to potentially move from one state to the other over time. And at the same time, do you see emission trading systems taking steps in that direction at the moment, if we look at real world examples?
The second one is easy. The UK and the EU are there. California is already, where the UK and the EU are discussing it. California is already there. There are a number of jurisdictions that already include, for example, removal units. The question is really, what this paper tries to address is, how do we go from there to what is the role that the ETS plays really in the long term? And I think I do see many jurisdictions, including the 3 ones that are here represented, actually having those conversations. So to Analia's question on what design elements permits an ETS to change from, for example, net positive to net zero, the main change that happens there is the one of what compliance units are available, right? And that's the primary change. And the difference between net positive and net zero is that net positive has conventional allowances and net zero only trades in removal units. So that is, in this particular question, the one big design element that you would need to switch. But of course, any change in the system will entail a big political societal conversation about what is the role of that ETS, how are we designing it now, and how are we thinking about it in the future. There was also, while I have the floor, there was one question about, wait. Where is it? There was a question from Alec on could an ETS address instances of carbon capture storage risk? Yes. So perhaps Ruben can correct me if I'm wrong, but to the extent that you include provisions for removals into the ETS in the case of the EU ETS, and I hope I'm not making a mistake here, Ruben, correct me if I'm wrong, the EU ETS directive is connected to the CCS directive. And so to the extent that there's CCS being used in the ETS, that carbon would have to be stored in accordance with the CCS directive, and the CCS directive has liability provisions, and so does the Annex 1 of the EU ETS directive also include storage sites such that any leaks would have to surrender allowances. And I see Ruben nodding, so I hopefully didn't get it wrong.
No, but also for the transport, the leaks during the transport is also accounted for.
See, I knew I was forgetting something. So there was a question also from Martin about other possible risks of integration, and a shout out also to the Concito and Clean Air Task Force report on this, which is excellent, and where he mentions that they identified the need to mitigate the risk of unsustainable use of biomass. And I fully agree with that. And it's also something that I identified when I said in net zero that there was the importance of taking into account threats to cost effectiveness when we spoke about the cost effective inclusion of removals into the ETS. Unsustainable land use is indeed one of them, and that's where I tried to plug it in the presentation. I don't know if I missed any other questions, but I'll stop there. I also wanted to poke the panel to take the question from Philippe on the international context, but I'll leave that to Stefan.
Can you actually read out the question from Philippe? I don't have it in front of me.
He said, opening the discussion outside this paper, in the current international context, such as the US withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, carbon tax on individuals withdrawn in Canada and British Columbia, how do you see the future of ETSs in achieving carbon neutrality? How can they be better designed and communicated for greater acceptance by the general population?
This is actually a good point and something I wanted to come to, because I mean we spoke about competitiveness, but the other elephant in the room is how to maintain, public support for these policies and how to make sure they are acceptable to society, which I think speaks to what Philippe was saying. So, if anyone has a thought on how to keep both industry but also society on board as we move to net zero. Thoughts would be welcome.
I can chime in maybe just briefly. I think I'm preaching to the choir, but if we are going to have targets for net zero or drastic emissions reductions, we need to follow through on them. And I think probably everyone here is in agreement that an ETS is the cheapest way to get there, right? And so I think there's definitely opportunities for communicating better on what this approach means and the benefits that are also derived, kind of co-benefits that from revenues that are brought up by the auctions and reinvested into various other efforts. Making the connection between the programs and those positive investment outcomes. I think, in California, we have not always done a great job of connecting that, and I think it's important to continue to improve that communication strategy and highlight those efforts as kind of one basic thing.
Thank you, Mark. Let's go to Ruben next.
I was going to make very, very similar points. I think it seems, though, and the Canadian example shows it, that there seems to be a difference between carbon prices that have a direct impact on consumers and carbon prices that have an indirect impact on consumers. So we see that the distinction between the ETS1 and the ETS2. In Canada, apparently they see it between the industrial ETS, which is not being touched, and the carbon tax on fuels that consumers pay when they fill up their cars. This is something indeed where communication is going to be extremely important. Recycling of revenues, making this into a progressive rather than a regressive measure. I think that's crucial. But I wanted to add also more positively that since we have launched the CBAM, we see a lot of interest from other jurisdictions, maybe not US and Canada, but from other jurisdictions who don't have carbon pricing yet, in really stepping up their efforts in implementing those. And we're quite excited and hopeful for the future to see more carbon prices coming online.
Thank you, Ruben. Let's go to Julia and then back to Mark after that.
Thanks. Just to add to what has been said, as I echo what Mark and Ruben said on raising public awareness and importance of communicating to our societies the benefits of emissions trading. I would like to raise 2 points. So in the recent EU ETS review, there was a proposal that got accepted in the final negotiations on the reform to have a special ETS label on all ETS funded projects across the EU. And we found it very simple, but also a very interesting, good way of basically showing directly benefits on projects that are funded with this money. And I think that this is something that should be done more often. This kind of communication should be boosted. And On ETS2, the ETS2 is being put in place, proposed by the Commission from the year 2027 to replace, basically support measures that currently member states undertake to deliver on their targets in the non-ETS sectors that do not deliver the environmental targets. So it is actually a measure that will make it more effective to reach the targets, but this is also the most cost-effective option for member states not to miss on their non-ETS or effort-sharing targets. So I think there's also lack of kind of clear explanation on why this measure is being put in place, and actually that it may make it cheaper for member states to reach their targets.
Thank you, Julia. Mark.
Yeah, largely echoing what Julia just said, serious costs of inaction. I don't know if like doom and gloom is a real positive communication strategy, but we make commitments for a reason, right? And the reason is that there are very high costs of not doing anything to reduce emissions. And I think just keeping that connection. I'm sitting in Los Angeles right now. There were recent, like very severe fires here. In part, climate change was a contributing element to that. The costs, who knows what the costs are, but initial estimates are around $250 billion. Insurance companies are like very reluctant to insure in many places in California for fire. And so, we have to do something. We have to, and these are the cost-effective ways to do it with the really least impacts to consumers and businesses.
Thank you, Mark.
So that needs to fit in somehow, and somebody with communication skills can figure that out.
Thank you, Mark. Felix.
So I agree with lots of what has just been said. I thought I'd just come in and reinforce the point about international action that Ruben made, to say that the UK very much agrees on that. We think carbon pricing is most effective when it's deployed widely across borders. And we have there's a team that sits next to my team that whose sole purpose is to try and encourage that to happen and share UK expertise. It's also one of the reasons why we like ICAP so much. It's really important what you guys do, and also the Global Carbon Pricing Challenge, also a really good and important initiative. So we very much support international action.
Thank you, Felix. I'm conscious that we are coming towards the end of the webinar, but I wanted to end with a bit of a forward-looking note, in the sense that as I was explaining when we started, this is a long-term overall work stream that ICAP is working on. The report that we just put out distills the where we are at with that discussion, and distills the current level of thinking and discussion in the ICAP membership. But at the same time, it's clear that this work will continue. There's a lot of interest and appetite in the ICAP membership to do more work on this topic, and Steph's ended their presentation with a few points for further consideration and future research, which I will ask her to recap quickly, and then I wanted to have a super quick round of reactions from the panelists on what do you think we should look into next, and what do you think still remain unanswered when you think about these topics, and what would be useful for ICAP to look into. But Steph, can you recap what you think would be useful as a next step?
So for me, big questions are issues of small markets. So when is a market too small, and how to deal with that, addressing abatement deterrence, including by, for example, limits to the volume of CDR that is allowed into the ETS, and also sequencing, net negative policy packages and the role of the ETS therein, as well as considerations for intensity-based systems. We've been talking about systems with absolute caps, but there are many, many systems that have intensity-based caps. And yeah, that I'll stop there. Curious to hear what others think.
Thank you, Steph. Let's go back to the panel in the same order as we started. So we'll do Felix, Ruben, Mark, and Julia. What should we do next?
So for us, we're very focused on trying to respond to the consultation that we put out on this topic, and just press on with integrating engineered removals into our trading scheme. So we have a very clear action plan.
Thank you, Felix. Ruben.
Sorry, my mouse is not working, but I hope I'm unmuted now. I think of the topics Stephanie mentioned, they're all interesting. I think I would probably put small markets, number one. And also something you mentioned in the presentation, but maybe I didn't get to that all the way at the end of the paper. I think you called it externalities, or the side effects, negative side effects of removals. So to what extent can you compare a removal with a mitigated emission? Air pollution, or also what you said about the land availability, or the renewables that you need for ducts. I think those would be interesting to look into as well.
Thank you, Ruben. Mark.
Yeah, I think what jumped out to me, similar to Ruben, small market concerns, and just to explore that a little bit more, it would be interesting to understand kind of sequence of steps for transitioning from the different phases like the 5 different phases you laid out, and what it means to transition from a net positive to a net negative, for example. I don't know how that would work exactly, but lots of interesting work potentially there. And then potentially, there's a supply side market concerns, if there's not enough removals, or are there opportunities for market manipulation if you're in a net negative scenario where you're reliant on projects to be essentially generating the credits for the market? Are they going to sit on credits and pump up the price? How's that market managed when you're not the entity controlling the market supply? There's something there to explore. I think there's a lot of fertile ground for additional work here, and again, just applaud the work. And I guess the one other thought I have is, based on California's expectations, there's going to be a lot of removals needed. And so, really figuring out the ways to maximize scaling of removals, if that means both within ETS and complementary approaches, it's an important question. And, potentially even going out well beyond when we're net zero, if we are overshooting and need to achieve net removals in the back half of the century, figuring out how to massively scale these types of projects up is going to be important.
Thank you, Mark. Julia.
I have a couple of very concrete replies to the question, what shall happen next? I think we should all think big, think global, and think long term. And more precisely, on the EU side, published a 2040 proposal for the climate law review, launched a consultation on the integration of carbon removals under emissions trading, and clarify end uses for CRCF, so carbon removal certification framework. On the UK side, respond to public consultation on integrating carbon removals in the UK ETS that closed in August last year. Link EU and UK ETS, and that should be followed by hopefully more linkages, more connections, and creating more global carbon pricing regime. And overall, we need roadmaps for removals integrations under compliance systems to provide this long-term clarity and stability to markets.
Thank you. Any final thought from you, Steph, or anything you want to come back to? Will this keep you busy for the coming months, or?
For a week or two. Nothing but a big thank you for the fantastic discussion, for the kind words, to the audience for the great questions. I wish we had more time. But yeah, thank you very much.
Also, big thanks from my side to Steph, Katia, Victor, Hermia, and the broader ICAP team that supported the work, for the ICAP members that have contributed to the work. Obviously, big thanks to Mark, Ruben, Felix, and Julia for being with us today. And obviously, thank you for all of you for bearing with us over the last 90 minutes or so, discussing what is effectively a fascinating topic. This, as it's clear from this discussion, is not the end of the journey or the end of the discussion. There will be more work done under ICAP, so keep an eye out for that. Practically speaking, we will be discussing pretty much the same topics in Lisbon next week at AITA's European Climate Summit. So if you're there, make sure to participate to the plenary discussion on ETS and net zero. And last but not least, as ICAP, we do not only work on the future of emission trading systems, but we also keep an eye on existing emission trading systems and on the current state of play. And in 2 weeks, we will be launching the annual ICAP ETS status report, which will provide an overview of where we are today with the implementation of emission trading systems globally. We have 2 webinars on April 8 and April 9, so make sure to participate if you want to see where we are at today with the implementation of emission trading systems. With that, again, thank you all, and we'll see you very soon at more events, webinars, and discussion opportunities. Thank you. See you soon.